The Widow's Fire. Before we start, just a reminder, if you enjoy this kind of content, subscribe to the channel. Now, let's get to the video. The storm's arrival. The autumn rain hammered against the wooden shutters of the old ranch house with a persistence that spoke of nature's determination to reclaim what man had built. Thunder rolled across the Montana plains like the hoofbeats of 1,000 wild horses, and lightning split the darkening sky with jagged fingers of white fire. Inside the modest dwelling, Jake Morrison sat hunched before the stone fireplace, steam rising from his soaked clothing as the flames licked hungrily at the seasoned oak logs. At 42, Jake was a man carved from the same hard stone as the mountains that bordered his land. His weathered hands, scarred from decades of ranch work, held a tin cup of black coffee that had long since grown cold. Water dripped steadily from his dark hair onto the rough-hewn floorboards, creating small puddles that reflected the dancing firelight. His broad shoulders, still powerful despite the years of back-breaking labor, sagged with the weight of exhaustion that came not just from the day's work, but from the loneliness that had settled into his bones like winter frost. The storm had caught him checking the fence line in the north pasture, where his prize cattle grazed on the last of the season's grass. By the time he'd made it back to the house, he was soaked through to the skin, his boots squelching with every step across the muddy yard. Now, as he sat before the fire, he couldn't shake the chill that seemed to have taken permanent residence in his chest. A cold that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with the empty rooms behind him. The ranch house, built by his grandfather's hands 60 years ago, had once been filled with laughter and the warmth of family. But time had a way of taking things away, piece by piece, until a man found himself alone with nothing but memories and the endless work that kept his hands busy and his mind from dwelling on what he'd lost. His wife Sarah had been gone 3 years now, taken by the fever that swept through the valley one particularly harsh winter. They'd never been blessed with children, and now the house felt like a tomb, filled with echoes of conversations that would never come again. Jake lifted the cold coffee to his lips and grimaced at the bitter taste. Outside, the storm showed no signs of abating. If anything, it seemed to be growing stronger, as if the very heavens were angry about something. It lived through enough Montana storms to know this one would likely last through the night, maybe into tomorrow. The cattle would hunker down in whatever shelter they could find, and there wasn't much he could do for them until the weather broke. He was considering whether to heat up the remains of yesterday's stew when he heard a sound that didn't belong to the storm. It was faint at first, almost lost in the howling wind, but unmistakably human. Someone was knocking at his door. Jake set down his cup and listened intently. There it was again. 3 deliberate raps against the heavy wooden door. He frowned, wondering who would be fool enough to be out in weather like this. His nearest neighbor was old Tom Brennan, whose spread lay 5 miles to the east. But Tom was smart enough to stay indoors when the sky opened up like this. Rising from his chair with a grunt, Jake crossed the room in 3 long strides and lifted the heavy wooden bar that secured the door. The wind immediately tried to tear it from his hands as he pulled it open, and rain lashed across the threshold like tiny whips. Standing on his porch, silhouetted against the storm-dark sky, was a figure he hadn't expected to see. Mrs. Hartwell echoed out over the wind, his voice carrying a note of surprise and concern. Elizabeth Hartwell stood on Jake Morrison's porch like a vision conjured from the storm itself. Her dark traveling dress clung to her slender frame, heavy with rainwater, and her usually immaculate auburn hair hung in wet tendrils around her pale face. Despite the circumstances, she maintained the dignified bearing that had made her the subject of much discussion among the local ranchers and townspeople since her arrival in the valley 6 months ago. "Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice barely audible above the wind, "I'm terribly sorry to impose, but my buggy broke down about a mile from here. The wheel came clean off and my horse She paused, wrapping her arms around herself as a particularly violent gust of wind sent rain driving across the porch. I'm afraid I had to leave poor Duchess tied to a tree. He couldn't manage her in this weather. Jake didn't hesitate. Get inside before you catch your death, he said, stepping back and gesturing her into the warmth of the house. We'll worry about your horse and buggy once this storm passes. Elizabeth stepped across the threshold, water pooling at her feet on the wooden floor. Jake quickly closed the door behind her and dropped the bar back into place. In the firelight, he could see that she was shivering violently, her lips tinged with blue despite her attempts to maintain her composure. You need to get out of those wet clothes, Jake said, then immediately felt heat rise in his cheeks at the impropriety of his words. I have some blankets, and there's a screen you can change behind. I'll turn my back, of course. Elizabeth managed a small smile despite her discomfort. Thank you, Mr. Morrison. You're very kind. Jake busied himself stoking the fire and adding another log, trying not to think about the woman standing behind him, dripping wet and probably wondering what kind of man she'd thrown herself upon the mercy of. The truth was, he'd noticed Elizabeth Hartwell from the moment she'd arrived in Copper Creek. It would have been impossible not to. She was easily the most beautiful woman to set foot in the valley in years, with her striking green eyes and the kind of refined bearing that spoke of education and breeding. But she was also a widow, and Jake had been raised to respect such things. Her husband, from what he'd heard in town, had been some kind of businessman from back east who died suddenly, leaving her with enough money to buy the small cottage on the edge of town, but not enough to return to whatever life she'd left behind. She kept to herself mostly, appearing in town only when necessary and maintaining a polite but distant demeanor. That discouraged casual conversation. Mr. Morrison. Her voice was soft, uncertain. Yes, ma'am. I was wondering. That is, would it be terribly improper if I were to warm myself by your fire? I'm afraid I'm chilled through to the bone. Jake turned around to find her standing near the door, still in her wet dress, but having removed her soaked cloak and bonnet. Her arms were wrapped around herself, and he could see the violent trembling that shook her entire frame. Without a word, he strode to the large wooden chest that sat beneath the front window and pulled out a thick wool blanket. Here, he said, approaching her carefully, as if she were a wild animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. Wrap this around yourself, and please, sit by the fire. There's no impropriety in trying to keep from freezing to death. Elizabeth accepted the blanket gratefully, pulling it tight around her shoulders. You're very kind, Mr. Morrison. I know this is highly irregular. Nothing irregular about helping a neighbor in need, Jake said gruffly, gesturing toward the chair he'd vacated. Especially in weather like this. Can I get you some coffee? It's not much, but it's hot. That would be wonderful, thank you. As Elizabeth settled into the chair by the fire, Jake busied himself in the small kitchen area, grateful for something to do with his hands. He could feel her presence like a physical thing, filling the empty spaces of his home with something he'd almost forgotten existed. The simple act of having another person in the house, someone to care for and worry about, awakened feelings he'd thought buried with his wife. He returned with a steaming cup of coffee, noting how the firelight played across Elizabeth's features as she stared into the flames. There was something haunting about her beauty, a sadness that seemed to echo his own. When she looked up to accept the cup, their fingers brushed briefly, and Jake felt a jolt of electricity that had nothing to do with the storm raging outside. Thank you, she murmured, wrapping her hands around the warm ceramic. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't been. Lucky thing you knew where to find me, Jake said, settling into the chair across from her. Not many folks would venture out this far from town. Elizabeth was quiet for a moment, sipping her coffee and seeming to gather her thoughts. I was coming to see you, actually, she said finally, her voice so soft he had to lean forward to hear her over the storm. Jake raised an eyebrow. To see me? What a... Elizabeth Hartwell set her coffee cup on the small table beside her chair and pulled the wool blanket more tightly around her shoulders. The fire had begun to warm her, but she still felt a deep chill that seemed to have settled in her bones, not just from the storm, but from the months of loneliness that had preceded this moment. She looked across at Jake Morrison, this weathered man who had opened his door to her without question, and felt something stir in her chest that she'd thought died with her husband. "I've been thinking about you, Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "About our conversation in town last month." Jake frowned slightly, trying to recall the encounter she referenced. It had been brief, a chance meeting outside the general store when he'd helped her load supplies into her buggy. They'd spoken for perhaps 10 minutes about the weather, the upcoming harvest, nothing of particular consequence, at least nothing he'd thought was consequential at the time. "I'm afraid I don't follow, Mrs. Hartwell." Elizabeth's hands twisted in the fabric of the blanket. "You asked at me how I was managing living alone. Most people ask out of politeness, but there was something in your voice. I understanding, as if you truly knew what it meant to be alone." The fire crackled between them, sending shadows dancing across the walls. Jake felt his throat tighten. He remembers the conversation now. Remember how something in her green eyes had reminded him of his own reflection in the mirror, the look of someone trying to carry on, despite a fundamental piece of themselves being missing. "I suppose I do know something about that," he admitted. "We've been on for 2 years now," Elizabeth continued, her voice growing stronger. 2 years since Robert died, and in all that time, I've spoken to perhaps a dozen people beyond simple pleasantries. I've become quite accomplished at being alone, Mr. Morrison. Too accomplished, perhaps." She paused, staring into the fire as if seeking courage in its depths. "But tonight, when my wheel broke and I found myself stranded in this storm, I realized something. I wasn't afraid of the weather or the darkness. I was afraid of going back to that empty cottage, of sitting alone by my own fire for another endless evening. And I thought of you, in this house, probably sitting just as I found you alone by your fire." Jake felt something twist in his chest. "Mrs. Hartwell, Elizabeth," she said quietly, "please. I think we're past such formalities, don't you?" "Elizabeth," he repeated, and her name felt strange and wonderful on his tongue. "What exactly are you saying?" She turned to look at him directly, and in the firelight he could see tears glistening in her eyes. "I'm saying that I didn't come here by accident tonight. Yes, my wheel did break, and yes, I am stranded, but I was already on my way to see you. I'd been working up the courage for weeks." "The courage for what?" Elizabeth stood up suddenly, the blanket falling away from her shoulders. Her dress had begun to dry by the fire, but it still clung to her figure in ways that made Jake's mouth go dry. She moved to the fireplace, placing one hand on the rough stone mantel and staring down at the flames. "The courage to ask if you might want some company," she said. "Not just tonight, but in general. I know it's improper. I know what people would say. A widow woman approaching a bachelor rancher. But I'm tired of caring what people say, Jake. I'm tired of being proper and alone and slowly disappearing into myself." Jake rose from his chair, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Elizabeth, I see how you look at me in town," she continued, not turning around. "The same way I look at you, like someone who remembers what it felt like to have another person to care about, to worry over, to share the small moments with. We're both too young to spend the rest of our lives alone, don't you think?" The storm outside seemed to intensify, as if nature itself was responding to the tension in the room. Jake took a step toward her, then stopped, his hands clenched at his sides. "What are you asking me, Elizabeth?" She turned then, and he saw that the tears had spilled over, tracking down her cheeks, but she wasn't crying from sadness. There was something else in her expression, something that made his breath catch in his throat. "I'm asking if you think it's possible for two people who have lost everything to find something together. I'm asking if you believe in second chances, in the possibility that loneliness doesn't have to be a permanent condition." She took a step toward him. "I'm asking if you would consider letting me stay. Stay? Jake's voice came out rougher than he intended. Not just tonight, Elizabeth said, moving closer. I mean really stay. I know it's scandalous. I know it flies in the face of everything we're supposed to believe about proper behavior. But I've been proper for 2 years, Jake. And it's nearly killed me. I want to feel alive again. I want to wake up in the morning and have someone to make coffee for. I want to fall asleep at night, knowing I'm not the only person in the world. She was close enough now that he could smell the rain in her hair, could see the flakes of gold in her green eyes. I want to matter to someone again, and I want someone to matter to me. Jake reached out slowly, as if she might disappear if he moved too quickly, and cupped her face in his rough hands. Her skin was soft and warm, and when she leaned into his touch, he felt something inside him that had been frozen for 3 years begin to thaw. Elizabeth, he whispered, are you sure? Once we cross this line, I've never been more sure of anything in my life, she said, covering his hands with her own. Have you? Jake Morrison had always been a man of action rather than words, someone who expressed himself through the work of his hands rather than flowery speeches. But as he looked into Elizabeth Hartwell's eyes, he found himself searching for the right thing to say, the words that would convey the magnitude of what she was offering him and what he wanted to offer her in return. I've been alone so long, he said finally, his thumbs brushing away the tears on her cheeks. I'd almost forgotten what it felt like to want something more than just getting through another day. Elizabeth smiled then, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her since she'd arrived in the valley. It transformed her face completely, chasing away the shadows of grief and loneliness that had seemed permanently etched there. Then we're both remembering together. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the ranch house, but inside, the world had narrowed to just the two of them standing before the fire. Jake pulled Elizabeth closer, and she came willingly, her hands resting against his chest, where she could feel the strong, steady beating of his heart. For a long moment, they simply held each other, two people who had been adrift, finding anchor in each other's arms. I should probably tell you, Elizabeth said, her voice muffled against his shoulder. I'm not entirely sure I remember how to do this. How to be with someone, I mean. It's been so long since I've had to consider another person's feelings, another person's needs. Jake chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest. Well, that makes two of us. I reckon we'll figure it out as we go along. She pulled back to look at him, her hands still resting on his chest. What about the neighbors? The people in town? They'll talk. Let them talk, Jake said, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. I've spent 3 years caring too much about what other people thought, about doing the proper thing, about not dishonoring Sarah's memory by moving on. But Sarah's gone, Elizabeth, and I'm still here. We're both still here. Elizabeth nodded, understanding passing between them like a current. Robert would want me to be happy, she said. He used to say that the worst thing a person could do was waste the life they'd been given.
I think I've been wasting mine for long enough.
The fire popped and crackled, sending sparks up the chimney, and Jake became aware that Elizabeth was still wearing her damp dress, still chilled from her journey through the storm. You need to get out of those wet clothes, he said, then quickly added, I have some things that might fit you. Sarah was about your size. For a moment he worried that mentioning his late wife might break the spell that had settled over them, but Elizabeth simply nodded. You'd be grateful for anything dry. Jake led her to the bedroom, a space he'd barely entered since Sarah's death, except to sleep. He pulled open the large wooden wardrobe and retrieved one of Sarah's nightgowns, a simple white cotton garment that would be warm and comfortable. As he handed it to Elizabeth, their fingers touched again, and he felt that same electric jolt. I'll give you some privacy, he said, starting toward the door. Jake, Elizabeth called softly. When he turned back, she was looking at him with an expression that was both vulnerable and determined. You don't want to be alone anymore. Not tonight, not any night if you'll have me. The words hung between them, heavy with implication and possibility. Jake felt his heart racing, as he understood what she was asking, what she was offering. "Elizabeth, are you certain? We don't have to rush anything. You can stay in the spare room, and we can take our time figuring this out." She shook her head, stepping closer to him. "I've spent 2 years taking my time, Jake. 2 years being careful and proper and alone. I don't want to be careful anymore. I want to feel alive again." Jake reached for her, then, pulling her into his arms and kissing her with all the longing and loneliness of the past 3 years, she responded with equal fervor, her arms winding around his neck as if she were afraid he might disappear. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "Are you sure?" he asked one more time, his forehead resting against hers. "I've never been more sure of anything," she whispered. Later, as they lay together in the bed that had been empty for so long, listening to the storm gradually subside outside, Jake marveled at how completely his world had changed in the space of a single evening. Elizabeth lay curled against his side, her head on his chest, her breathing deep and even in sleep. For the first time in 3 years, the house didn't feel empty. For the first time in 3 years, he didn't feel alone. When morning came, bringing with it clear skies and the promise of a new day, Jake woke to find Elizabeth already awake, watching him with those remarkable green eyes. "Good morning," she said softly. "Good morning," he replied, still hardly believing she was really there. "Any regrets?" Elizabeth smiled, the same radiant smile that had transformed her face the night before. "Only that it took a broken wagon wheel to bring me to your door." Jake laughed, pulling her closer. "Well, remind me to thank that wagon wheel." As the sun climbed higher, painting the Montana sky in shades of gold and pink, they began to talk about the future, about Elizabeth moving her few belongings from the cottage in town, about what the neighbors would say, about the possibility of marriage when enough time had passed to make it respectable. But mostly, they talked about the simple joy of not being alone anymore, of having someone to share the daily rhythms of life with. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and new, and in its wake, 2 lonely souls had found each other, proving that sometimes the most unexpected circumstances can lead to the most extraordinary beginnings. As Elizabeth had said, they were both still here, still alive, still capable of love and happiness and hope. And that, Jake thought, as he held her close, was more than enough to build a new life upon.